findings related to trends in mass murder in the United States. So,
sure. Thank you, Doug. I'm Grant Dewey. As Doug mentioned, I'm Director of Research for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. I'm not going to be talking about research that I've done at the Minnesota DOC, but rather I'm going to be talking about research that I did mostly before I got to the DOC. I may not look like it, but I am a grizzled veteran of mass murder research. I've been doing this for about 20 years. In fact, I started doing research on the topic when I was a graduate student at Florida State University. And I did my dissertation on this very topic, on the history of mass killings within the United States. And when I started my research, I had always kind of had this idea in my head that hey, this would make for a nice book. But my dissertation committee had the audacity to have me shape it into a dissertation. So once I finished, I turned it back into a book. I've published several academic journal articles on the topic along the way. But after I published my book on the topic in 2007, that was also around the time of the Virginia Tech massacre. And since that time, I have frequently been interviewed by the news media, usually after a high-profile mass killing has taken place. And one of the questions that I frequently get from journalists when I talk to them is what my perspective is on trends in the prevalence and patterns in mass shootings. And so then the question I have for them is, well, what are you talking about when you say mass shooting? Then they say, well, what do you think it means? And so we have this conversation over, okay, what exactly are we talking about when we use phrases like mass murder, mass shootings, mass public shootings? And very simply, mass murder, at least how I've defined it, is an incident in which 4 or more victims are killed, regardless of the type of weapon used, within a 24-hour period. And as I'm going through my presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free. I'll try to leave some time at the end to answer any questions that you have, but sitting here for 40 to 45 minutes and thinking, oh, I have that question at the 10-minute mark, just go ahead and ask it. So the research that I've done, it's based on data that have been collected on more than 1,300 mass killings that have taken place in the U.S. from 1900 up through 2014. And some of the more infamous examples of mass killings include like the St. Valentine's Day massacre, the Clutter murders in Holcomb, Kansas that were immortalized by Truman Capote in his book, In Cold Blood. And then more recently by cases like the Virginia Tech massacre, Columbine, the mass killing that took place in Newtown in 2012. So we have our definition of mass murder. Now remember, these are all incidents, regardless of the type of weapon used, in which 4 or more victims are killed within a 24-hour period. I consider a mass shooting to be an incident that's defined as a mass murder, except the offender just used a gun. Okay, so when we're looking at mass shootings, this, as we'll find out, this includes mostly familicides. Like most of us are probably familiar with a case that occurred in Greenwood last year, where you had a father killed his wife and his 3 kids and then committed suicide afterwards. Now, he used a gun, but it also took place within the home. That also didn't get a whole lot of attention outside the Twin Cities metro area. That's also something that we see with mass shootings in general. But the other more common type are felony-related massacres, where you have a small group of offenders who use a gun to kill victims, usually in order to evade detection, killing eyewitnesses and so on. But we have the mass public shooting. And I've defined these incidents as gun-related mass murders that occur in the absence of any connection to other criminal activity, like robbery, gang warfare, contract killings like mob hits and so on. And these are far and away the most newsworthy mass killings. What happened at the Pulse nightclub, what happened last week in Dallas, these are mass public shootings. And these have always been very highly newsworthy. And they have driven perceptions about mass murder as well as mass shootings, because some of you may not remember, but in the late 1980s and early 1990s, mass murder was considered to be this new crime problem. And it was considered to be a crime problem amid the larger violence problem that we had at that time. And high-profile mass shootings were instrumental in helping secure passage of the federal assault weapons ban in 1994. But then most recently, it's also driven our perceptions as to what the typical mass shooting is. Our current mass shooting problem is just a new problem that's essentially the old one. We're just calling it something new. It's basically our old mass murder problem, but now we're just calling it mass shooting. So when we're talking about mass murder, one thing that's important to keep in mind is, just how prevalent is it really? And unfortunately, it is something that is an infrequently occurring event. Because when we look at the data, especially since the mid-1970s when we have good data, we see that on average there are about 28 mass killings each year. Remember, these are all incidents in which 4 or more people are killed, regardless of the type of weapon used. And given that there are about 5 victims per mass murder, we see about 140 victims of mass killings each year. Since that same time, we've seen on average a little more than 14,000 homicides in this country. So what that means is that within a given year, mass murders make up 0.2% of all the homicides committed. But the 140 victims make up about 1% of all homicide victims. So this is something that occurs infrequently. At the same time, however, it also has an outsized impact on perceptions of violent crime, public safety, and so on. So, one of the questions that I addressed or have addressed with my research is, at the time that I started, researching this topic in the mid to late 1990s, it was assumed at the time that mass murder was a historically new phenomenon, that it was something that really did not exist prior to the mid-1960s. And there are 2 incidents in particular that are cited as kind of the bellwether of this dramatic increase in mass killings. One is the murders committed by Richard Speck in Chicago. Actually, tomorrow will be the 50-year anniversary of those killings, where Speck killed 8 student nurses in a row house. 1 survived. And at the time, the coroner who worked on the case dubbed the crime, or dubbed the murders as the crime of the century. But then about 2 weeks later, Charles Whitman killed his wife, his mother, and then the next day climbed to the top of the tower at the University of Texas in Austin, and ended up shooting more than 45 people, killing 16 before he was gunned down by police. And actually, just before coming here, I got off the phone after doing an interview with a journalist who's doing a 50-year retrospective on Whitman case. And so those 2 incidents in particular really shaped perceptions as to what constitutes mass murder. When did this unprecedented wave of mass killings begin? And so the mid-60s, those 2 cases in 1966, really kind of encapsulated that. So what we see when we look at the data is that mass murder, or at least the rates of mass murder, were just as high in the 1920s and 1930s as they were from the mid-1960s up through the early to mid-1990s. And even when we go farther back, before the 20th century, anecdotal evidence indicates that there were a number of mass killings that took place in the U.S. Most of those occurred in connection with things like racial terrorism in the post-Civil War South, the labor movement, and the Indian Wars. Now, some of you may have seen after the Pulse nightclub massacre that some in the media were saying this is the worst mass shooting that's ever taken place in American history. And then some segments in social media really took umbrage with that. They said, well, wait a second, it was Wounded Knee. That was more catastrophic. There were nearly 300 victims who were killed, or the Tulsa race riots. And so that actually goes back, by the way, to I'm not a big fan of using the phrase mass shooting because it is imprecise. Is this a mass shooting? I would say yes. But that's why I think using a definition like mass public shooting is a little more specific and kind of captures the incident that everybody is currently talking about when we say mass shooting. But here's a graph that just shows the mass public or the mass murder rate per 100,000. And then the dotted line is the U.S. homicide rate from 1900 up through 2009. And actually the high point for the mass murder rate is in 1929. We see that it's nearly as common during the 20s and 30s as it is from the mid-60s up through the mid-1990s. But another thing that kind of stands out when we look at this is that you'll see that trends in the mass murder rate kind of mirror those for homicide in general. And so what that suggests is that even though mass killings are this extreme sort of violence that we have, they may share a similar causal structure, whatever that may be, with homicide in general. But then another question that arises, a lot of people want to focus on, why have mass shootings increased, or, why is mass murder on the rise? But maybe the more important question is when, especially when we look at the longer-term historical data, why were the rates so low during the 40s and 50s? And we also see the same thing when we narrow it down to mass public shootings. We see very few cases during the 40s and the 50s. And we do see a rise in pro-social indicators. The main life experiences for men of the silent generation were Great Depression, World War II. And I say men because they're most of the ones who commit mass murders, okay? Then we see a greater harmony between expectations and achievements, so there's less strain, and greater involvement in conventional activities and opportunities to develop a stronger bond of society. So, I mean, this is just some, kind of theorizing on, some of the reasons why we might have seen lower rates during the 40s and 50s. We can't subject this to any kind of hypothesis testing or anything like that. But so, those are the trends that we see when it comes to the prevalence of mass murder. Okay, so what about the patterns of mass killings? When we look at the characteristics of those who carry out these attacks, what do we see? And so as I just mentioned, the vast majority are males. Guys, we have cornered the market on mass murder. I mean, 93% are committed by males. We see that roughly 2/3 are white. That's actually a percentage that's relatively close to what we see for the U.S. population in general. Sometimes you'll see coverage after highly publicized mass shootings, and some of the coverage is like, why are mass shooters almost always white? Well, even, and I'll get to the mass public shooting data too, which kind of show the same thing, but the evidence says, well, that's not actually the case. It's just that there's a more egalitarian distribution when it comes to race, ethnicity than what we see for, say, homicide in general, where there is a more even distribution between whites and non-whites. So when it comes to offender age, we see that the average is 30 for those who commit mass murder, slightly older than your typical homicide offender. When we look at offenders who commit mass murder who are under the age of 18, we see that they're mostly involved in what I call progeny familicides. And these are cases where, You have the offender who kills his parents and his siblings, or they're involved in felony-related massacres, where it's usually the offender is with a group of other young males, and they may commit mass murder in connection with, say, the robbery of a convenience store or a drug deal that went bad. And we see in these cases that they're less likely to use guns than adult offenders, more likely to use a personal hands-on type weapon. And then we also see that they're less likely to commit suicide than adult offenders. So when we look at motive and victim-offender relationship, what are some of the things that we see? Well, we see that revenge is far and away the most common motive. We also see that mass murders often kill someone they know. Stranger victims make up about 25% of the victims in mass killings. That is higher than what we see for homicide in general, but not by much. But family member is the most common victim-offender relationship among mass killings. Like the case I mentioned in Greenwood, I mean, about 45% of all mass killings are familicide. That is far and away the most common type. So where do mass murders take place? I've looked at the data and have just made a distinction between has it taken place in a residential setting or has it taken place in a public setting. And we see that only 27% take place in a public setting like a school or a workplace or a mall, and the remaining 73% take place within the privacy of one's home. And that's driven largely by the fact that so many mass murders are familicide, which almost invariably take place within the home. So sometimes we'll hear that an individual has carried out a catastrophic mass shooting and the offender just snapped, or he just went berserk. But that could not be further from the truth, because what we see, and this applies to those who carry out mass public shootings as well as to those who kill their families, that usually these are preceded by a great deal of thought and deliberation. There's a lot of planning that will typically go into this. We also see that mass murders frequently express their intentions to others through threats or other types of communication. And what's interesting is that the cases where mass murder snaps are typically not those associated with mass murder, like a felony-related massacre or even some arson-related cases. And just to kind of illustrate that, we have the Virginia Tech shooting, and after that took place, it was said that he snapped, but he had been writing about his violent intentions for several years. And when we look at the case involving the Aurora shooter, which took place in 2012, where 12 were killed and nearly 70 were wounded, that as that case went to trial, and during the trial, it came out that he had actually been thinking about committing mass murder for 10 years. I mean, think about that. He had been ruminating about that for a decade. And so, this is not something that is a spur-of-the-moment type of event. And so, even with the Virginia Tech shooting, we see that he spent several $1,000s buying firearms and other weaponry. He prepared his multimedia manifesto, so he was very prepared for this. On the other hand, we have the case involving Julio Gonzalez, who killed 87 in New York City in 1990 by setting fire to a club. And this was a club that was very packed. It exceeded its limit per the fire codes. And in this particular case, he had been trying to reconcile with his girlfriend, who was a DJ who worked at the club, and she refused to get back together with him. So enraged, he went down the street, bought a can of gasoline, poured it, set the place on fire. No one could get out. Well, actually, there are only 5 people who got out. Ironically, she was one of the 5 survivors. And so this is an instance where he did just snap. And it was something he decided to do spur of the moment, and 87 people ended up getting killed. But that's not something that we typically think of when we think of someone who's a mass shooter who snaps. How about weapon use? You know, it's often said that you know, firearms are the weapons of choice for mass murders, and to a large extent that's true. I mean, we see that 2/3 of the mass killings that take place in the U.S. involve the use of firearms, but we also see that the level of gun use in mass murders, it's about the same as what we see for homicide in general. You know, really the main difference when it comes to the type of weapon that's used involves the use of fire. Like the case involving Julio Gonzalez, mass murders are 13 times more likely to use that as a weapon compared to homicide offenders in general. How about mass murders and the use of high-powered weaponry, like assault weapons? Well, when we look at the data, we see that about 4% of mass murders, and these are gun-related mass murders, have used assault weapons. We see that the rate for gun-related mass murders overall, it's about the same as for gun-related homicides in general, which is 0 to 4%. The main difference that we see is that when we narrow it down to mass public shootings, we do see a higher rate of assault weapon use, and I'll get to that more later. But when we look at those mass murders involving assault weapon use, we see that they're about as lethal as other mass killings. That is, the number of victims killed in assault weapon-related mass murders, it's about the same as what we see for other mass murders. The big difference, though, is in the number of wounded victims. That is, people who are shot but they're not killed, we see about twice as many wounded victims in cases involving assault weapon use. Do mass murderers typically commit suicide afterwards? We see that about 30% engage in suicidal tendencies, about 22% actually commit suicide or force others to kill them, usually suicide by cops at the scene of the crime. Another 7% attempt to commit suicide. Given that we see a rate of suicide after homicide to be less than 5%, we do see that mass murderers are at least 5 times more likely to engage in suicidal behavior than homicide offenders in general. You know, the one thing that's interesting is that when we look at the different types of mass killings, we see that the tendency to commit suicide or engage in suicidal behavior is not distributed equally, because we see that for those who commit parental familicide, and I'll talk about all these types on the next slide, but those who commit parental familicide, the suicide rate is about 64%, like the case in Greenwood. Usually about 2/3 of those cases, the offender ends up committing suicide afterwards. For mass public shooters, it should be 56%. But then those who are lower risk, like progeny familicide, 16%, the felony-related cases, that tends to be more like homicide in general. We see several predictors of risk of suicide. One is age, that the risk of committing suicide after homicide increases as the offender gets older. And usually the closer the relationship between the offender and the victim, the greater the risk of suicide. And also where we see that the violence is more expressive rather than instrumental. And what I mean by that is that when the violence is expressive, the violence is the end in itself. Whereas when it's instrumental, it's a means to an end. So like with a felony-related massacre, where the offenders go into a convenience store, kill all 5 eyewitnesses there, the violence isn't necessarily the end in itself, but rather it's the means to get away. and to pocket the cash that they have and hopefully never get caught for it. Whereas when someone kills their family or carries out a mass public shooting, that's it. The violence is all there is. It's not necessarily a means to an end. So what are the main types of mass murder that we see? Familicides, as I mentioned, by far the most common, nearly half of all mass murders. And among familicides, we see that most are parental, while a minority fall into the progeny category. Then we have felony-related massacres. That's about 1/4 of all mass killings. We see robbery, drug-related cases, and then we have the mass public shootings. These are, remember, these are the most newsworthy cases that generate extensive amounts of publicity, interest, fear, anger, concern. These make up a little more than 1/10 of all mass killings. And then we have about 1/5 that fall into, say, an other category, instances of terrorism or arson. But when we look at parental familicides, they make up 3/4 of all familicides that we have. Usually, these are cases where it's the head of the household, often the male, who kills spouse, children, relatives, or some combination of these. When women commit familicide, one thing that we do see is they are more likely than males to exclusively target the children. Does anyone remember the case involving Tua Her in St. Paul in 1998? Anyone? Nope? Okay. Well, she killed her 6 children while her husband was out of the home. And then she attempted to commit suicide afterwards, but wasn't able to do so. And then, she's currently at the correctional facility at Shakopee. But that's an instance where you have the offender exclusively targeting the children and was not targeting her spouse. Whereas when males typically commit familicide, they generally kill the whole family, their partner and the children, and they often commit suicide afterwards. So we see two main scenarios for these offenders who are often depressed and suicidal. One is revenge. And sometimes we even see these mixed within the same familicide. But usually it's killing the spouse or the partner for revenge. The idea here is if I can't have you, then no one will. It's kind of this obsessive, controlling kind of love, if you can call it that. But here, we also see that the motive for killing the children is a little more altruistic, if you can call it that, because the idea is that, well, I know I'm going to kill my wife because she's threatened to leave me. If I can't have her, no one else is going to have her. And if I kill her, I'm planning on killing myself. If we're both gone, don't want the kids growing up as orphans, or maybe we'll all be able to reunite in the afterlife. And so, these are generally the thought process that you see for that type of case. But then we see one where it's motivated strictly by altruism. There's no threat of divorce or anything like that, but instead maybe you have the male head of the household who perceives himself as the breadwinner, and there have been numerous instances where can't make ends meet, and I don't know what we're going to do, and may be depressed and suicidal. And when people get depressed, that's a word that we kind of throw around, but you kind of have blinders on. You can't see other solutions that lie outside of your own very specific situation. Just going back to the case that took place in Greenwood, there still hasn't been a lot of details released about that, but it was speculated at the time that financial difficulties were kind of at the root of that, and that there was a bankruptcy involved. That may have led to depression, but then we see other instances where people have bankruptcies. We even have some very prominent people who have celebrated the fact that they have bankruptcies. So I mean, it's kind of a matter of perspective here. But You know, in this other instance, we see that the motive is more altruistic, that, you know, there's no revenge necessarily committed against the spouse or the partner. So with progeny familicides, the mass murderer kills his parents and siblings, you know, less common than parental. Usually we see that the age of the offender is younger here, much less likely to commit suicide. You know, one thing that stands out about these cases is that the motive often seems very trivial. You know, going back in time, using a local example, in 1941 in Little Falls, Minnesota, we had a 16-year-old who killed his parents, his sister, and his brother. And so when asked about the motive afterwards, he said he was tired of being bossed around. He was getting tired of doing chores on the farm and felt he was being bossed around, so he killed his family. With felony-related massacres, you know, again, instrumental violence, killing eyewitnesses to avoid detection. Compared to other mass killings, these are much more likely to involve multiple offenders. In fact, about half the cases involve multiple offenders. And here we also see that the offenders are younger, more likely to be a racial ethnic minority. We also see that they're likely to occur in a large urban area, target strangers, and involve the use of firearms, about 85%. And finally, for the last part of my presentation, I'm going to focus on mass public shootings. Not because they're the most common type of mass murder or mass shooting, but because they capture the most attention and they drive a lot of the discussion in public perception and understanding about what this type of extreme violence is. So, you know, again, I've talked about the definition. You know, talk a little bit about the demographics. There have been 180 mass public shootings that are in my data set since 1900. All but 2 of these were committed by males. Again, we see that the percentage committed by non-Hispanic white offenders is about the same for the U.S. population in general. We see that the average age for the mass public shooter is about 34, a little higher than what we see for other mass murderers. But you know, there is a difference when we compare it with homicide in general. We see that nearly half of those who commit homicides in this country are under the age of 25, whereas with mass public shootings, it's only 25%. And these include school shootings too, by the way. We see that more than half, 56%, committed suicide or were killed by police. There are 2 instances where the offender was actually killed by a civilian. That is double the rate than what we see for other mass murders and more than 10 times the rate that we see for homicide in general. Nearly 2/3 had a precipitating or triggering event, at least that we're aware of. Usually, and most often, this is failure at work or at school. Roughly 1/3 of the 180 communicated threats, either verbally or in writing, before the attack. And we see that about 60% had a serious mental illness prior to the attack. And I say at least 60% because for some of the older cases, there isn't as good of information on that. But what is notable is that for some of the more recent cases, this is a higher percentage. And most commonly, we see paranoid schizophrenia, followed by depression, or another type of mood disorder. Now, when we look at weapon use and the severity of mass public shootings, as I mentioned, mass public shooters are more likely to use assault weapons, about 3 to 4 times more likely. And one thing that we do see with mass public shootings is they are more severe or more catastrophic than other mass murders. Because we see that the average number killed is about 7 and nearly 6 wounded per incident. That is higher than what we see for other mass murders. And and sometimes when I talk with journalists, I will sometimes point out that their decisions as to what's newsworthy kind of help drives the, like body count, for example, the number of people who are killed or wounded, that is by far the strongest predictor of whether a mass killing gets reported by the news media. But when I talk about, the criteria of newsworthiness, journalists usually are disinterested in that, which is kind of interesting that there's that lack of introspection about their own profession, which, actually a good portion of the research that I've done on this topic has focused on how the news media covers mass killings and how it has played a key decisive role in how mass murder has been socially constructed as a crime problem. But we see the higher body count, which certainly contributes to the newsworthiness, but then we also see that these cases are more likely to target stranger victims, which connotes random violence. The idea here, when people see this, is anyone could have been a victim of a mass shooting. Wrong place, wrong time. Also, when they take place in a public location, these are highly visible events, highly visible acts of violence. Unlike a familicide that takes place in the home, where everybody is killed, there's no one who lives to share that account with the news media. But then when we have a mass public shooting that takes place in a public location, there are often eyewitnesses, and now with social media, there are even instances where people are even able to capture video of the attack as it's going on. And so the audience is able to vicariously experience the terror and the horror of that event. So one of the questions that has kind of dominated some of the public discussion about this is, have mass public shootings been on the rise? If you think they've been on the rise, hold up, raise your hand. Just a couple? Yep? Okay. Well, you're sort of right. Because it kind of depends. Because, whenever we look at trends in crime over time, it's imperative that we account for population change or growth in the population. And, and this is a nice example here. When we look at homicides in the U.S. over time, with everything else pertaining to crime, it's all, we talk about the crime rate. Or the violent crime rate. Well, in 1969, we had 14,760 homicides. 2011, we had 14,612, separation of 148 homicides. However, in 2011, we had 110 million more people in the U.S. So our rate in 2011 was about 35% lower, 4.7, than it was in 1969, where it was 7.3. The same applies, or I think it should apply when we're talking about mass public shootings, even something as infrequent as that. The only difference is that I've expressed it in terms of 100 million as opposed to 100,000. And so this is just the mass public shooting rate per 100 million looking at incidents. Not the total number of victims killed or the total number of victims shot. I'll get to that. But for right now, it's just the incident. And so what we see here, when we go, these are just the raw numbers of cases. So from 76 to 84, there were 24, and then 30 from 85 to 94, 32 from 95 to 2004, and then over the most recent 10-year period, it's 43. And so we do see an increase in rates, at least within the last 10 years. But, this black line is also a 5-year moving average. And so we actually see the highest point for our 5-year moving average, or actually our highest 2 points, was right here in about 1984 and right there in 1995. And again, when I mentioned at the beginning that the federal assault weapons ban was passed in 1994, well, a lot of that was due to these spikes that we see here in mass public shootings, which fueled a lot of public fear and concern over the use of high-powered weaponry in these types of incidents. And so, that's why, sometimes there's this impression that what we've seen here is unprecedented and that it's never happened before. It's like, well, actually it has. The main difference is that look at the consistency that we see from year to year. This is 2012. That was an exceptionally bad year for mass public shootings, and I'll go into that in a little more detail. But up from about the mid-2000s to the present, there's a high degree of consistency, whereas from the early 1980s up through the mid-1990s, we see high peaks and low valleys. We don't see that consistency. And so part of that, and this is just the 10-year moving average. Well, even when we look at the 10-year moving average, the 1990s, the high point is 2000. So from 91 to 2000 had the highest 10-year rate. But it's that consistency that we've seen over the last 10 years or so that has really kind of contributed to that perception. So there has been an uptick in the mass public shooting rate, but it's not unprecedented. But the key difference, at least when we're talking about perceptions, does have to do with that higher peaks and lower valleys. And within the last 10 years or since the mid-2000s, it's that lack of any kind of let-up that fosters this perception that I've seen is unprecedented, and that they're now more common. And we've even seen words like routine applied to mass public shootings. So on the question of has the severity of mass public shootings, when we look at the number of victims killed and the total number of victims shot in mass public shootings, has that increased? And the answer here is a little bit clear, that yes, we have. And but again, it's important that we, when we're looking at trends over time, that we adjust for population growth. So this looks at the total number of victims killed per year from 1976 through 2014. The black line again here is a 5-year moving average, and we see that it's fairly high in the early 90s, but our highest point is actually here in 2012. Again, as I mentioned, 2012 was a really bad year. There are more victims killed in mass public shootings, 67 in 2012, than in any previous year. So this looks at the total number of victims shot. Again, we do see some relatively high rates here, but again, 2012 is our highest 5-year average. Essentially from 2008 to 2012 is the 5-year period where the greatest number of victims were shot in mass public shootings. So what can we say then about trends in severity? Well, like what we see for trends in the incidence of mass public shootings, this also contributes to perceptions about things getting worse. Because remember that the body count, number of victims who are killed and wounded, that is a significant predictor of news coverage. So yes, we have had more high-profile mass public shootings that generate a lot more news coverage in the last 10 years than perhaps we've ever had. And 2012 was a historically bad year. What is worth mentioning, however, is that so far this year, if we just stopped right now, bless you, the 60 victims killed and the 64 wounded, those would be the second highest totals that we would see going back to 1976. So even if we don't have any mass public shootings for the rest of this year, then the 3 that we have so far, due mainly to the one at the Pulse nightclub, this would be the second worst year. So the question is, well, why are we seeing these trends? And that's a good question, and I don't have any definitive answers for you. I mean, the truth is that usually there are a number of things that are mentioned. Is it guns? And, you know, and usually when I've talked about this, people on both sides of the issue aren't overly thrilled with what I have to say because, you know, on the one hand, you know, I did a study back in 2002 with some co-authors, and because there is this economist who had published this research, and he's published a book called More Guns, Less Crime. So you kind of know where he's coming from, right? So he had published this study that said, well, the places that have right to carry concealed firearms laws, they have lower incidence and severity of multiple victim shootings. And so we tested that same hypothesis with the mass public shooting data that I have, and we found it has no impact. Doesn't make things better, doesn't make things worse. You know, when we look at the federal assault weapons ban from '94 to 2004, I mean, when we look at mass public shootings in terms of the incident and the severity, I mean, we see a slight dip, but it's not huge. But even proponents of the ban and those who are involved in getting it passed have acknowledged that there were specific makes and models that were banned, but at the same time there were a lot of other weapons that were functionally equivalent to those. So, you know, kind of, even though there was this ban, there's still a lot of pessimism as to whether it actually had any kind of impact. But then even when we look at the incidence of mass public shootings, that, you know, rates of gun ownership were relatively stable during that time, but then we also see that mass public shootings began to increase. And so, you know, I'm sure there are probably a number of things that could be done in this area, but, you know, would they have an impact on mass public shootings? I don't know. Would they make things worse? Probably not. But, you know, if the issue is what can we do to reduce this type of violence? I don't know if you know, gun control legislation, or, you know, whether it's loosening or tightening gun laws would be the answer. Mental health reform, that's another popular one that's been raised. I mean, we do see that mass public shooters have a relatively high rate. It's almost 60%. You know, when we compare that with rates that we see for adults in the U.S. population, we see that it's 3 times higher than any rate of mental illness, 15 times higher than the rate of serious mental illness. You know, and even those who have been identified as mentally ill, only about 1/3 sought or received mental health care prior to the attack. So that means that 2/3 were untreated. So, you know, this is our treatment gap. What we do see, or at least the evidence suggests, is that, you know, when we look at the treatment gap in general for mental health, it's generally greater for males. We try to avoid going to the doctor of for anything. And then, you know, the treatment gap is actually worse in the U.S. than most other Western countries. You know, sometimes after a high-profile mass shooting is you know, one of the comments that's been made is, well, it's not like the U.S. has more crazies than other countries. It's like, well, but there might be more people who have serious mental illness that aren't getting treated. I mean, that's a possibility. But, you know, the bottom line is that serious mental illness is just one of a number of risk factors, because we see that the vast majority with serious mental illness don't commit mass murder. And so, you know, when it comes to trying to reduce the incidence or severity of, you know, mass public shootings or even mass murder in general, you know, we're kind of dealing, you know, we're trying to prospectively identify or cut off these incidents before they occur. But, you know, whenever we're trying to predict something, that we're dealing with something that is extremely rare. But, you know, with mass murder, mass public shootings, we have, you know, what I call the prevalence paradox, that it's something that it's routine, but yet it's rare. Because, you know, it may seem common, but when we look at it, since the early 1980s, we've averaged about 4 mass public shootings a year. That actually works out to 0.0003% of all homicides each year. And so when it comes to assessing risk or making predictions, I mean, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for something that is that infrequent. So, I mean, really our best case scenario, and this is something I've recently come across, is that, you know, there are individuals who make forecasts pertaining to catastrophic earthquakes or catastrophic terrorist events. I mean, that may be the best we can do for something like this. It's not identifying the place or the individual, but it may at least indicate what the probability is for a, you know, something as horrific as what took place at the Pulse nightclub. What was the probability of something like that happening? What's the probability of something even worse happening in the future? That actually is possible. So just to conclude, I'll wrap up and then take any questions that you might have, is, you know, it's important to emphasize the outsized influence of mass public shootings. Whether we're talking about mass shootings or mass murder in general, that mass public shootings really kind of define the essence of the mass murder problem when it was identified in the 1980s and even in the early 1990s. It was a gun problem, a workplace violence problem, a school shooting problem. But even more recently, we see that the same thing has taken place with the new mass shooting problem. We see that use of the phrase mass shooting has increased significantly over the last 10 years. But we're still talking essentially about the same problem. Because when we were talking about mass murder, it was really the mass public shooting. Talking about mass shootings today, we're not talking about familicides. We're not talking about felony-related massacres. Again, we're talking about mass public shootings. But yet these comprise a small portion, when we're talking about mass murder, 12% of all mass murders. Mass shootings, 17% of all mass shootings. These make up a relatively small portion of the problem that we're ostensibly talking about. So that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any.
Earlier on in your presentation, you indicated that the perpetrators were less likely to be suicidal. But later on in your presentation, it seemed like, particularly for the familial homicides, that there was a lot more suicide. I'm just wondering, and it seems to me that the mass shooters, mass public shootings, all tend to end in the death of the shooter. Briefly.
This one?
Higher risk. Yeah.
When we look at the outcomes, that usually those that end in the offender's death, it's usually parental familicide and mass public shooting. Like with the the local cases, like the one that occurred in Greenwood, would be the parental familicide. He committed suicide afterwards. And even locally, here in Minneapolis, we had the case, I believe it's in 2013. Engeldinger was the individual's name who committed a workplace shooting, and he committed suicide afterwards. But then when we look at cases like progeny familicides and felony-related cases, we see lower rates. Usually the offenders are younger here too.
Very impressive, the amount of detail on your data. You have to go.
And I didn't even cover everything. You got a couple more hours now.
Well, I'm kind of curious. There's been a lot of talk about how difficult it is to collect this data, like the CDC is prevented from collecting it. You have to go to both the press and the FBI and local police.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you asked that question, because this is really a key piece to this too. And this also allows me to kind of talk a little bit about some of the other lists that exist, like Mother Jones and the Gun Violence Archive and the Mass Shooting Tracker and all these different definitions and lists. But what I did is that I used the FBI's supplementary homicide reports. data, which it really goes back to 1976. That it exists before 76, but it really wasn't a very good source of data up until it underwent some major revisions in 76. And the nice thing about the SHR data is that it's far and away the most comprehensive source for all homicides that have taken place in the U.S. Now, having said that, it has a number of limitations or drawbacks. One is that it's a voluntary program involving law enforcement agencies nationwide, so about 10% of all homicides don't get reported. There are years where there are homicides missing for a whole state. Like Florida was really bad during the 90s and the 2000s about submitting homicide data to the SHR. But then another limitation is that there are a lot of errors in the data where the information is entered incorrectly, where you may have what appears to be a homicide incident involving 4 victims, but when you get more detailed information, it's actually a double homicide and they counted the victims twice. Or it's for a 4-victim homicide or a quadruple homicide, but only one of the victims was killed, the other 3 were shot and wounded and not killed. Or there have been instances where 2 jurisdictions reported the same incident. So I mean, there are just a number, or cases where the offender was included as one of the victims. So there are a number of issues with the SHR data, and then it doesn't contain a lot of detail. So like knowing whether the offender committed suicide afterwards, the SHR is not going to tell you that. Whether it took place in a private home or a public location, not going to tell you that, which is why it's also important to use news accounts or news coverage. So I've used the SHR to kind of anchor my search for the more detailed information, because the SHR identifies when and where it took place. It's like, great, that's what I need. And so then search for news accounts. The use of the news accounts is beneficial because it can help identify those cases that weren't reported, the 10% underreporting rate. But then, like, the only way I found out about those other problems with the SHR is by trying to find the detailed news accounts. Like, why can't I find this homicide involving 5 victims? Surely it was covered. Now, I see this other case that was a double homicide where 3 victims were wounded. It's like, oh, well. So, you know, using that triangulated data collection strategy really pays off in terms of capturing all the incidents, but also getting more detailed information. Which brings me to some of the other lists that really have kind of popped up over the last 5 years. Mother Jones being the first one. You know, there's the issue of definition. They're using, you know, what I've tried to go for is using definitions that are parsimonious and more elegant. That, you know, like when you start adding a bunch of stuff on, it makes it more difficult to operationalize. It's just keep it relatively straightforward so that you can identify all the cases that meet your relatively simple definition. And so when you start including things like offender motive and whether the victims were killed indiscriminately, it's like, well, how do you make that judgment? And so, I mean, those are some of the challenges with Mother Jones, or some of the other shooting lists, you know, will include, you know, wounded victims or killed victims. I mean, and that becomes really problematic because all of these are relying exclusively on news coverage. No one else to my knowledge has used the SHR except for USA Today did an investigative series in about 2013, but that was because after Newtown they talked to me and I said, you really have to do it this way. And then the other was the Congressional Research Service came out with a report last July, which is really well done. I mean, if you want to read something about, you know, that's not too long, that covers 1999 up through about 2013, firearms-related mass killings, Congressional Research Service did a really solid report where they used the same data collection strategy. But you know, one of the things that we see in just relying on news coverage is that, again, the number of victims who are shot or killed is such a strong predictor, what that means is that, yes, if there are 7 or 8 or 9 victims who were killed, it's going to be reported. But for the lower victim count cases, you're not going to find as much coverage. And especially for those where, a definition that says, well, I'm going to call mass shooting anything in which 4 or more victims were shot, irrespective of whether they were killed. Those cases involving 4 wounded victims, I mean, who knows how many of those don't even warrant news coverage, especially in a larger urban area where, there's more competition for news space. So, and even when I've looked at some of these lists, whether it's Mother Jones or the Gun Violence Archive, just looking at the cases involving 4 or more that ostensibly meet their definition, I found that there's an underreporting issue on their part. And like I wrote kind of an op-ed piece that appeared in Reason back in 2014 looking at the Mother Jones list and saying, their coverage of cases within the last 4 to 5 years is pretty good. But the farther back you go in time, because they go back to 1982, the underreporting problem gets worse. And that's because they rely on the news coverage, which is less accessible the farther back you go in time. While that may sound very wonky, it's not, it actually has some significant implications, because when you have good coverage of the more recent cases, it really bolsters your argument that these are getting so much worse. And what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, nothing like it has ever taken place. But with their list, they don't have good coverage from the 80s and especially in the early 90s when we do see that higher frequency of cases, or at least for mass public shooting.
So we have reached 1:30, and I know some people are on a tight schedule. So if you need to leave, now's a good time. We have the room for another half hour, and we go on with the question and answer if you have time.
Sure.
So, but it also is my chance to say thank you very much for your presentation, and also thank Mark.
Does anyone have any other? Yeah.
One question. You said there's so far in 2016 there are 60 killed according to the qualifying factors, 3 shootings. Pulse, 3 Texas.
Yeah, in Dallas, and then there's one in Kalamazoo back in February.
That was the college one, right? Or was that last year?
That was 2015 in Oregon.
Oh,
Yeah, that was, I think, October. Yeah, that was in October.
All the data is great. Any guesses on motive? Why someone would do a mass public shooting?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's mostly for the sake of revenge. And usually when we look at mass public shooters, that we see that there's usually this idea that others are out to get them, that some group of people is responsible for all the problems in their life. That's why they're miserable. Whether it's a group of people at their workplace who may have conspired to get them fired, or like in the Virginia Tech massacre, it was this entire community, or it can even be more abstract than that. But usually the mass public shooting, it's payback time, and it's done for the sake of revenge. And usually because you see the mass public shooter perceives that others are out to get him, they tend to be very distrustful of others, which is why it's not that surprising to see a lot of them are described or characterized as loners. I mean, if you think everyone's out to get you, you're probably not going to be hanging out with people very much. And so that that is something that we don't see that in every case, but that does occur frequently enough. And usually, like I mentioned, the Holmes case from Aurora, he'd been thinking about that for 10 years. And usually we see this period of deliberation where they're planning about it, thinking about it, fantasizing about it. And a lot of times during that time, they're also communicating too, whether it's telling someone or writing something. There's a lot of times there's some communication about their violent intention. And then usually, as I said, there's, in a lot of cases, but not all, in a lot of cases, there's often some kind of triggering event that the individual considers to be catastrophic, whether it's getting fired from their job or losing an important relationship or failure at school or something else that kind of precipitates the attack. And so, and then once the attack takes place, then there's usually some planning that goes into that. But before the attack, it's usually this group that I'm exacting revenge upon. They've ruined my life. I'm going to kill them, and because my life is ruined, I'm going to kill myself too. So I mean, that's usually, that doesn't describe every case, but for the vast majority, I would say that it does.
So most of them are typically related to a personal motive, but have you ever graphed it out relating to a societal change as far as like income inequality that might prime somebody or create a situation in which they're more likely to occur?
Yeah, I don't know. Could you talk a little bit more about what you're thinking of?
So like in the 70s, people's income started to stagnate, and that stagnation and whether that related at all to the frequency of how often it happened and more recently as well.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that. I mean, the major issue is just having good data that goes back that far. Just because with something like this, you're looking at cells that have a lot of zeros when you're looking at mass public shootings. And that's why sometimes even looking at mass shootings or mass murder in general might be a little more revealing. And I suppose if this was the only thing that I did, then I might have time to do that. But I usually forget about this until something horrific happens, and then I start getting contacted, and then it just kind of sucks me back in. So yeah, I mean, would there be value in looking at that? Absolutely. But I don't have any analyses that have done that stuff.
So we could spend another whole day talking about media and reporting and actually stuff. One thing, Hollywood always seems to portray the veteran as some crazy guy. Okay, has incidents of veterans who have done mass shootings, that's been more than the general population?
There are some cases where you have veterans who have committed mass public shootings, but I haven't looked at it
Compared to a service station guy.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just off the top of my head, I mean, I can think of some where the individual was a veteran, like Howard Unruh committed a mass public shooting in Camden, New Jersey in 1949, where he killed 13, wounded 3 more. Charles Whitman, the UT Austin massacre, he was a military veteran. The case in Dallas from last week, he was a military veteran. But whether, I haven't actually looked at all the cases to see whether there is any kind of military experience. But even if it was a little bit higher, I don't know if that would be something that would be implicated in them doing or them committing the violent acts that they have.
Sort of this like nexus of different things that you've been talking about today kind of swirling in my head, and it starts with the graph you had about the drop in the rates during the 40s and 50s, right? And this idea of, I think you call them pro-social factors being higher there. And it reminds me of stuff that I've read like by Robert Putnam of Bowling Alone, that this idea that civic society is sort of falling apart, this. The places where we come together as a community don't exist like this. And, you know, characterizing mass public shooters as being lone wolves, who are sort of ostracized from society in that way. And then I think too about, you mentioned this idea of sort of predicting as a way, you know, trying to, the probabilities that something like this might happen. And I guess it's all coming together around this idea of, I don't know if there's any way that it's tracked or measured, but if there are places in the United States where civic communities are really strong, if there would be a way to look at that and whether they're more or less likely to have these types of events.
Versus urban,
Yeah, I mean, would you consider the Twin Cities to be a place where that would rank highly?
I don't know, and to be honest, I don't even know if you could do it at the city level because, you know, it could be so micro, but macro at the same time.
Yeah.
But it just seems like there's so many interesting, you know, like you said, and you can look at guns, you can look at mental health.
like trying to find
But-
fault lines in particular, you know.
Right, because
Well, that's why I was going back to the earthquake 7.0 on the Richter scale.
Because like with the prediction, you know, part of my graduate work, I looked at terrorism. And when you talk about splinter cells and lone wolves and the idea that, you know, after Aurora, it was, is anyone safe to go to a movie theater anymore, right? And that's where that sort of probability, well, in all likelihood, are you likely to be shot in a movie theater? Probably not.
Right.
But, you know,
It's one time where we come together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I would say the issue is less one of having good data on our dependent variable, mass public shootings or mass murder, but it's more of an independent variable issue. Like, do you have data that stretches back? You know, you can't just do a single year because again, it's routine, but it's rare. So so you don't have that. So you need a fairly significant chunk of time to study things like that. And for a lot of these social, economic, political indicators, they're not available. Although I mean, I'm sure that if this was crowdsourced somehow, that people could come up with something. But again, like, this isn't my day job. So so yeah, you know, part of me feels a little conflicted about this because I have collected data on it, and it's like occasionally people have said, well, you should put together a website and post the data on there. I'm like, yeah, that's fine and good and all. I think my wife might have some issues with that. So me taking spare time to do that. So
it wasn't so much a question, it's just there's, to repeat, you know, there's some really interesting stuff in here. It's just,
I want to bring up a question about profiling, and if there's any way to these mass shooters that profile.
I mean, are you talking about profiling in like the serial killer profile sense, where you have profilers try to say, well, we think it's this kind of individual who committed these series of crimes? Is that what you're going to talk about?
Or more predictive. People who commit this kind of crime fit a certain profile as a lone wolf, and if there are other attributes that they like.
Yeah, I mean, there are some character, you know, which is focused on mass public shooters. There are some characteristics that are relatively common to those individuals. You know, you could look at age, race, ethnicity. You could look at things like, you know, have they made verbal threats? Have they, you know, is there serious mental illness present. But in order to really develop something like that, you would need a larger sample, and you would need a point at which you would then kind of assess that risk. And what is the point at which you would do that? Is it when they come to the attention of law enforcement or come to the attention of a mental health professional? So it's largely what, you're trying to predict something that's rare, that is very unlikely to occur. That's not to say that it can't be done. I mean, part of what I do at the Department of Corrections is develop risk assessment instruments. And one of the things that we assess risk for is like sexual recidivism or even first-time sexual offending, which are very rare. We're looking at a base rate of anywhere from like 1 to 3%. So, I mean, it can be done accurately, but it's like how do you get all that kind of data, and at what point do you then kind of apply that risk assessment? And how do you get access to all of that? So, I mean, could it, conceptually, is it possible? Sure, but is it feasible now or anytime soon? Probably not, because, I mean, again, you'd need to have access to all this kind of data that I just don't know exists right now.
I hope you get a good dose of puppies and kittens every once in a while.
Well,
it sounds like you have a lot of very dominant data to look at.
Well, actually, my wife has said she's like when we go to social gatherings, she'll say don't talk about mass murder, don't talk about sex offenders, it creeps people out. Like, but they asked me about it. What am I supposed to do? So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Speaker.
Yeah, really good.